Thank you, Professor Sonia. And greetings to all of you. It's an honor to be able to meet you like this in these difficult times. So, a changing world, planning and design for a post-COVID future. And in a way, this is an optimistic talk, but also with a tinge of realism. I think we need some optimism about grasping some of the things that come out of this crazy situation we're in and making the most of it. I'm under house arrest, like all of us, and I'm lucky. I live in the center of a delightful city. I'm really enjoying getting out into my garden and hearing the sweet sound of the birds that over the top of what used to be that monotonous tone of traffic in the street. Allowed out once a day for an hour for exercise. I've already been out this morning. It's 11:30 here, and you have this crazy thing of 4.5 hours difference between you and us. And I walked down the middle of the road, so I'm probably going to have a sudden death rather than a COVID-19 death. But it's such a pleasure experiencing my city without cars, without pollution, breathing fresh air. And we've got to capture these things. So that is how I'll end. But I will begin with a need for us not to make a worse mess of the world. So let's look at the bigger issue of what sort of world we live in. Our politicians are almost falling over themselves to compete about how we'll get back to normal. Normal is a world of global trade. In the UK, for instance, we only grow half of the food that we consume. We export a lot of food. We import some of the same food, flown sometimes right across the world in both directions. It's madness. We're contributing to global warming, to climate change, simply by the way that we are doing things. Traditionally, our cities, and I want to talk about city planning and city design, you have to talk about the big political issues in order to get it right. Traditionally, our cities incorporated the country around them. And in this country, in 1947, the year of my birth, the year of the birth of modern India, in 1947, we had a Town and Country Planning Act that ensured that we maintained a green belt around our cities. That green belt, while it still exists, and it exists for leisure, it exists for people to keep their ponies and do other things, and there is a certain amount of agriculture. The food that is grown around our cities is not consumed in our cities. There has been a total detachment between the work in the country and the work in the city. And I believe that now is a time to relook at that, to think about how we set up small farms, sometimes community owned, sometimes privately owned, around the city that enable people who are working in the city to also work in the country, grow some of their own food, and so that there is a much better relationship. And also, we used to dispose of all our waste within the city region, and now we send our waste miles away. We pile up waste. Waste should be thought of as a resource. And if the city is in control of the area around it, and it has responsibility of disposing of everything within its area, that waste will become a resource. It'll become a resource for growing food, it will become a resource for building materials, and of course we will be encouraged not to waste at all. So I think the big issue is we need to design a better system for our cities, a better relationship between urban and rural areas, going to create perfect places. We have to make the most of what we've got. The fact is, we're probably all going to be a bit poorer financially coming out of this, but hopefully we'll be richer in other ways. And I think the job for urbanists and architects and designers is to see how we can create a more humane world and more humane cities. There's been this flight from the villages, from the country into our cities. In some ways, that has been a really good thing. In some ways, it has produced, yes, higher densities, but sometimes it's produced ridiculously high density. And we know of some of the slum conditions that have existed in some of our cities and some of your cities. And we need to look at answers to those. And I heard somebody on the radio from Glasgow yesterday, where slums were turned into high-rise developments. And it is those high-rise developments that are currently giving them their problem. Those high-rise developments with people isolated in small flats, with people living with people they don't want to live with, sometimes being abused by them, living with children and animals. And it is really, really challenging. And so we ideally would all like a house. We'd all like a house with a garden. And those of us who can afford one are fortunate. In the US, the great dream of having an individual house has resulted in ridiculous amount of sprawl. The cities reach out for miles and miles and miles. They are totally car dependent. There is not enough intensity to provide the public transport, to make a walkable place. In fact, you're thought of as a criminal if you're walking around some US cities because it is so strange. The police stop you and ask what you're doing, because I've tried it. The contrast, I suppose, is in China, where you have these marching blocks of dominoes, these massive blocks, where villagers have been forced to live in these great monocultures, and they have no food to grow. They have no shops. They have no facilities. There's just one place in the middle of these huge districts where they can meet, a community place with very limited facilities. Can you still see me and hear me? Because I have lost Sonia. Tell me if I'm still... you can hear me. I've lost you though, Sonia, anyway. But as long as you can still hear me and see me, I've said we have to adapt. One thing has become quite clear in this crisis is that people value outside space. We need every single dwelling to have some form of outside space. It may be that these great developments of high-rise buildings, we need to sacrifice some of the living accommodation and create bridges between them, that we have gardens in the sky, we have proper mixed villages in the sky, because it is completely unbearable for people to be shut up in these places, even at the best of times, not just at these worst of times. We also need to think about what is the best way of creating good densities to create good walkable cities. I look to some of the great European cities like Barcelona and Berlin and Paris and Milan, where typically they have 5 or 6 stories streets, quite broad streets. They have big courtyards, and it creates a sense of community around the courtyard. In Britain, it's more typically that you get 2 or 3, 4-story terraces of houses in streets with small gardens. Those streets become the heart of the community. Unfortunately, they've become parking lots. And maybe now people can appreciate, with the cleaner air and the clearer streets, we don't need these parking lots. We don't need everybody to aspire to a private car. We can share our transport. Clearly, at the moment, until we have a vaccine, people are going to be wary of public transport. But I'm talking about when we get beyond that.
So, George, if you will allow, I could bring in a few questions that are coming in.
Okay,
since we're talking about roads and parking lots, there's one question that's popped up. It says that waste materials like waste plastic rather, are being used for construction of roads and also for construction material, plastic with bitumen. So what are your thoughts in this matter is a question that has just popped up.
Well, it's a really good example. That is a really good example of what I'm saying, is using waste as a resource. And plastic turned into a building material is an excellent example. But I would also say why have we got so much tarmac? And now I think it particularly comes into focus when you see the extent of tarmac in our cities, and that we should be digging some of that up and planting trees and making art and making streets that are only accessible for disabled use or for deliveries. Deliveries, of course, have become an important issue, and as a result of that, and I think that the trends were already happening, our high streets will be very different. So yes, I think you raise a really important issue, is how not only do we reduce the amount of plastic that we use, and single-use plastic is a real curse, and we are tackling that in this country quite radically, but then how do we think of every single piece of waste, every bottle top, every bottle, every bag as building or construction resource?
So, George, if I may just come in, I was wondering that, you have, as mayor of Bristol, done not really different things. You can't put them in separate compartments, but maybe they are separate in their approach. You've done Rockefeller, which is about disaster resilience, and European City was about green and sustainable, and the UNESCO was for the learning. So I'm wondering, because what has happened with this COVID-19 is that it's caught us unawares. It's novel. How would you use your experience of, making Bristol the Rockefeller and the European and the UNESCO? How would you combine those experiences, and how would you say that Bristol is doing better than others, or not?
I'm not claiming that Bristol's doing better than others, but I think what you have raised is the other pandemic that we're facing, which is an environmental pandemic. Right. And I think these are linked. If you put health at the top of our agenda, then the environment is absolutely linked with that. And climate change and our abuse of the environment is probably resulting in hundreds more deaths than COVID-19. So that puts things into proportion.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think it's really important that a city, any city, puts the environment first, because that is putting the well-being of its citizens first. It will reduce reduce the prevalence of asthma, for instance, and asthmatics are people who are particularly vulnerable to these viruses. I think in all these things, and learning is really important. That's why I went for the UNESCO Learning City, because I felt that learning is much broader than formal education. It's something that involves all the citizens. It's something that's intergenerational, and the thing that we've got to learn really fast is how we cope with this attack on the environment, which is the direct consequence of the domination of big global corporates that who have a single bottom line instead of a triple bottom line. The single bottom line is simply, how do we make profits for our shareholders, and to hell with the rest. And the triple bottom line is, how do we make maybe fair but more moderate profits for our shareholders, but we look after people's social lives and their health and environment. And that should guide every single leader of every city and every country and every village.
So there's another question that's popped up, and it goes like this, that you are not new to India. You've visited Kolkata and Mumbai and many other cities. So you know that both Kolkata and Mumbai have a good public transport systems. I mean, other than the metro, there are buses, and even the last mile is covered quite well, especially in Kolkata. So the question is like this: that what should be, according to you, the next thing, priority list when we're talking about sustainability?
Well, I think the next thing that we should do is look at, do we need all these roads, these streets for cars? I always think that you need a carrot and stick approach. You can't just simply bribe people out of their cars. You have to find other ways, and it takes a bit of courage. It takes a bit of courage from political leaders to do this, because there is a very strong lobby, especially a strong middle-class lobby, about the freedom of being able to use the car. But one person's freedom can be another person's damage to another person's lives. And I'm looking for cities that have fingers of country coming into the city. They don't have to be wide. That we have a system of green roads around the city that are walkable. We get people back onto bikes. There's nothing better than a bike, whether it's a pedal bike or an electric bike. Two wheels, get more people around. They get fresher air. They get, especially if we've reduced the amount of polluting traffic, which is an absolute must in any city now. And one that is, of course, a very big issue in Indian cities. Just the pleasure of it is just fantastic. So green roads throughout our cities, green in inverted commas, but nevertheless, roads that link all our public spaces and our park, that make the first choice of moving around one that is of active, that is also of active exercise. And those roads should have priority over other roads. If necessary, they bridge across them. And so the dream, if you look at somewhere like Copenhagen, that is beginning to happen. And they do have these fingers of country coming into the city. Fingers that are not just for travel, they're also for flora and fauna, and the animals can move around the city in a way and link between the wildlife areas. So a really good city is one that incorporates nature into the city. My city has 1/3 green, public or blue water open space. And I think it's a very good guide. Our cities should aim to do that, is have, yes, high density in terms of the streets I've described, but as much of a network of green as is possible.
Another one question, and this is something that has also been irking me quite a bit, is that, we in the cities, and I'm sure that's true for our developing countries such as ours, in cities, digital environment is, works very well. So we have services delivery and we don't have to go out so much. But what happens in rural areas where digitization is not so good, connectivity is not so good? How do they, go about their daily life, getting supplies and such? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a general one that applies both to cities and the country, is that global trade has distanced people from their supplies, and we need to, both in terms of climate and for good social and economic reasons, we need to look at a much more local economies, self-sustaining local economies, which where things are made and produced that are needed within the country. An awful lot of farms are now simply a resource for big business that take away a lot of the food, that specialize in one food in one area, and are not giving people the whole complete diet that they need, because they are, they might be specializing even in tobacco or something in their growing, which is not much use to the families. So I think we need to look at agriculture, we need to look at manufacturing, and we need to look at developing local economies that are much more self-sustaining rather than dependent on international supplies. I see I've got one other question here that has popped up.
Yes, if you can see that, you can answer that if you want.
Which is completely different, but it's about electric cars, which don't use petroleum. Absolutely, I was going to say that no city should accept any internal combustion engines anymore, and we need to move fast towards hydrogen, electric, and people-powered vehicles. I will go back to people-powered vehicles, because you might think it takes longer. I can cycle around this city faster than I can drive around it. I don't have a car anymore. I occasionally will use an Uber if I need to transport something. But now I'm getting transport on my bike. And I think, I can afford a car, but the pleasure of not having one is absolutely enormous. I find it a real freedom. I never have to find a parking space. And I'm healthier. I'm 73, but I'm I will either be healthier or dead because somebody's mowed me down on my bike. But I think most of us can do that and should try it. But what puts us off is the terrible traffic that we have on our streets. So this needs a bit of authority. It does need somebody to be courageous to say, we're going to greatly limit the use of cars, and we're definitely going to greatly limit the use of the internal combustion engine, and maybe give it a 3 or 4 year life before we turn our cities into non-polluting vehicles. But don't think, therefore, we should all have electric cars, because it would be a nightmare in Indian cities if everybody had a car. So I think that leads us to the sharing economy, and the sharing economy is part of the answer to that previous question about the villages. A sharing economy where we share an awful lot of our resources. We share tools in the community. We share growing, so somebody might grow something and somebody grows something else, and you swap. And I think that there is so much more that can be done. And South Korea has been, and Seoul in particular, which I happen to be an honorary citizen and know, has built a huge amount on the back of the principle of sharing economies, which of course are traditional. If you go to Eskimo villages, or to some of the more some of those places that have been relatively insulated from modern life, the sharing economy still exists, and people greatly benefit from it.
Yeah, and these are two questions talking about the same thing. That as architects, how do we then learn to design with the trees and flora and the fauna, rather than cutting and deforestation? How can we really bring this in now? There are 2 or 3 questions in that. So
I think we've got to be clever about it. I don't think you have to retain every tree, but if you take a tree down, you should plant 10 more, because it takes time to replace the canopy of the trees that are so important to the health of the city and of the world. So I think it's being aware, not being not turning it into a religion, but turning it into an advantage in one's design. I would like to get on to smaller design. I'd like to talk about workplaces. I would like to talk about living space, and about leisure. I think these are directly appropriate to people's lives. So I'm hoping some of the questions might turn to that, which are about architecture. As architects, we should think about the context within which we're working. I think because of our education, we are well placed to be influencers in terms of those bigger pictures that I've been talking about. One thing that has been really noticeable in this time is the amount of people who have found it possible and even pleasurable to work from home. Of course, that doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to manufacture, but it applies to an awful lot of the services that people provide. And there's been a tendency in the design of our homes to go for more open living and open plan. And that's actually been militating against this desire to work from home. If you've got children and cats crawling over your work and interfering with your Zoom meeting or whatever it may be, it's not very helpful. So I think we need to think much more cleverly about the design of home and going to work within the home. That you don't just simply stay in the same spot, in the same chair as you had your breakfast, that you've been listening to the radio on, that you've been watching the telly on. You move, even if it's round the table, you move, but you also have to provide these cells within homes, I think, that enable people to work from home. And working from home will become so attractive to many people that it will become maybe a bit of a challenge for some employers who prefer their employees to come in and share thoughts at work. And maybe it will become a 2-3 day thing that people work partly from home and partly at work. But then the design of places of work becomes so much more important. We will not get away with just providing space and a desk. Employers will need to look at some of those more creative things that have come out of the Googles and the creative companies, where it's a real pleasure to be at work, where there are cafes, where there are pool tables, there's table tennis, there's table football, there's little meeting places, there's original works of art. So I think we have to re-envisage the home as a workplace, and we have to re-envisage the workplace as a leisure place or a relaxation, maybe somewhere where you can relax in the middle of the afternoon as well as work. I think it is an opportunity to think about that whole issue of that greater issue of well-being that will defend us from disease. Not simply think that hospitals are the answer to disease. It is public health and general well-being at home and at work that will make us stronger people.
So there's this interesting question that, how are streets going to be like? Because, even you've been talking about people in cities, we're talking about communities coming together. And now, post-COVID, we're talking about social distancing. We're talking about healthy distance between people. So how does that change public places and streets, the design change?
Well, of course, temporarily, and let's imagine it's 2 years before we have 7 billion vaccines or whatever. And I heard on the radio this morning that Oxford University believe that they are pretty close to having developed a vaccine, but nevertheless, to then turn, they may be being optimistic, but to then turn that into billions of vaccines and get to people and to know that it's effective is going to take some time. So for 2 years, I think, let's imagine, we are going to have to be better at social distancing. I don't think it therefore kills all social activity. Streets are great. And what's been wonderful in this country is that people have been getting on their doorsteps or opening their windows or getting on their balconies where they have balconies, and they've been exchanging across the street. Every Thursday night, we have been applauding our National Health Service workers, our carers in the old people's homes. They have been getting recognition. And I have met people in my street that I've never met before, because there's this unity that comes out of this challenge. And so the street, I think, is a great meeting place. I have borrowed, so that I could do a bit of gardening, I borrowed a hoe off somebody that I didn't know. We have set up WhatsApp groups for our streets so that if somebody needs something, they are able to borrow off somebody else. So I think streets are the ideal, and I'm talking about streets, not of individual detached houses. I'm talking about streets of terraced houses, which is the tradition in the UK. This community feeling of streets has been killed by the domination of streets by cars, and so I think we need to grasp that back. It's not fair to our children. Children should be playing in the street. That's what I did, and that's what I love. What I see in India is people with a cricket bat and a box and a ball in the street, and I think so. Streets of any scale, at least half of them should be principally places for people rather than for cars.
So there's one question about employment issues.
Sorry, I didn't fully answer that. Of course.
Okay, right. Please go on. Sorry.
Of course, we just should be sensible about keeping our distance. I know when I see some Indian streets and you see people absolutely packed in them, it's really difficult to imagine. But we've just got to be more. We've got to be more patient. And one of the idiocies is that we all go to work at the same time and we all leave at the same time. We do in this country, and we need to stagger that. So
yes.
And while I don't see technology as the answer to everything, I think we can use technology for distancing and for scheduling the times that people use streets and public places.
So yeah, just to get back to the employment issues, if we are going to be working from home and using much more of IT in services delivery, are we not eating into employment seeing that we have a huge labor force?
We're eating into employment if we work from home.
What I mean is that aren't there going to be employment issues? Because if we're working from home and we're using much more of digital services, then we are not employing that many people. I mean, we are losing out on employment of labor.
Well,
is that a fallout?
I mean, I think there is another issue. I don't think that is going to reduce employment. I mean, delivery. I mean, I'm terrified of the power of Amazon and the that is just becoming huge. But there will be lots of jobs that come out of this different way of living. And Amazon has just taken on 175,000 new employees only last week or something. So there will be other things that come out of it, and I think the way we eat will be different. We maybe restaurants. I'm a restaurateur, so I mean, and I have a brewery, and so my business is a completely shot at the moment. But I think social distancing, both inside and outside, is obviously going to change things for a couple of years. But as far as employment's concerned, I think the biggest threat to employment is robotics. I mean, robotics can be great in terms of replacing dirty jobs, replacing the jobs that people really do not want to do. But I think it's a danger if we, for instance, have completely robotic agriculture, when agriculture is such an opportunity for people to work. It's a matter of it's because we're driven by GDP, by gross domestic product, rather than by well-being. We are losing jobs. We gain jobs when we look at the overall picture of people's well-being and less about the single bottom line.
One concern is definitely the population density in a country like ours. And in such a dense country, to even introduce the idea that you have to maintain any distance can be very, very challenging. So do you think that, we could do something with the design so that we can try to incorporate this kind of a sense of maintaining distances? Because we are not just talking about the vaccine, and we don't know when the vaccine is going to come through. So till such time, do we do something with, even if it is office space, home, it's still understandable, but office space, do we do something in design which will ensure that distance will have to be maintained?
Absolutely. I'm sure that that's a matter of interior design and layout. I think because there will be less people likely to be using office space at any one time, instead of having less space, I think that businesses are more likely to use that space in a more generous fashion. I've already described some of the leisure things that they might bring into workspace, but I think it's an opportunity to separate desks more generously. In eating places, inevitably, there's going to be less people going to restaurants and bars for a time, and there's probably a case for making longer serveries so that people don't have to be next to each other, directly next to each other when they're ordering, and there needs to be tables marked out at 6 feet distances or whatever it may be, 2 meter distances. In the supermarkets, in the shops here, people are only letting a certain amount of the shops are only letting a certain number of people in at any one time, so that everybody can keep their distance. Outside all the shops, there are 2 meter markings and queues going quite far down the street of everybody keeping 2 meters. So I think we've got to be helped with this. I've already described about freeing up some of the streets so that they become streets for walking and cycling. And I think in those cases, we can indicate lanes that keep people apart from both in front and behind each other and beside each other. So we need help. We need to use markings. There's a lot we can do with a pot of paint. And a pot of paint can be a great design tool.
True. And yes, I mean, if you have cycle tracks and if you have walking tracks as well, then it also contributes to universal design, right?
Absolutely.
Right? So that also comes into play. Am I correct?
It's healthier, but also it's socially healthier. I mean, who communicates with anybody else in a car except to make signals and swear at each other? I think and use the horn too much.
Wheelchair friendly and
also
child friendly. Yes.
Let's look. When we move around, let's look at the things that take up the most space. What takes up the least space is one single person walking. What takes up the most space, and what takes up the next least space, apart from cyclists, is public transport, is a bus. And buses are, I think, a wonderful form of public transport. Never denigrate the bus. I mean, it's great when you have expensive metros and what have you, and maybe we've got to get more flexible with our public transport so that we have more smaller buses to go in more different places. That helps with employment too. You need more bus drivers with small buses. And then the most greedy form of transport in terms of space, not just pollution, is the car. And so you free the streets of cars, you get much more generous space. I know it sounds as if I'm banging on about cars. I am, because I think they are the curse of modern life and modern cities. They're also a benefit to families to be able to get out into the country. So maybe we store our cars in order to do that, but much more sensibly we share.
So were you able to get some of the questions from chat, or should I also?
Hang on, chat. Yeah.
I think you got one about electric cars.
Oh, yes. Right. It's got one here.
Yeah, right.
Considering a profession like architecture where work from home is not very efficient, considering the nature of the profession, what can we do differently to make a viable option? How big a role would technological advancement play in this? Well, I think the simple technological advancement has been our means of communicating without getting together, without flying. Increasingly, I'm able to do this. I'm able to talk with my family and talk with my colleagues at work. And I think the biggest technical advancement is to make that as friendly and as tactile as possible. I'm sure there are people working on touch and virtual hugging and those sort of things, but that makes it more bearable. Can we adapt our lifestyle? I think we are learning to adapt our lifestyle at the moment. But let's not give up the possibility, and I think the probability, that in 2 years' time, we will be able to hug each other and be friendly to be able to shake hands and be intimate, because I think that is a big public health issue. I mean, the third pandemic, I've described the second pandemic as being the climate, the environmental one. I think the third pandemic is the mental health one. And I think that this is something that we've all got to think of, whether we're designers or not. We have to think of how we ease the life of those who are in a bad way mentally. I mean, I was talking to a friend in London yesterday who's very well off, who lives in a large apartment, but is miserable and is having a fight mentally. And so, even the people who this doesn't discriminate, even the people who have a relatively comfortable lifestyle, some of them are suffering. But if you imagine that multiplied by a large number of people living in terribly cramped conditions, the mental health issue is the one that we have to design for. We have to think about, which comes back to this question of, people having to share the same room all the time, a mental health disaster in the making. So I think we've got to be really clever about how we use space, but we've got to be more generous with our space in our planning, and legislation will be necessary to enable that to happen. And that's many more jobs. That is creating a lot of construction jobs, for instance.
Right. An interesting question here. It says that, it's already gone a little into the future, and saying that because we are trying to reduce transportation with, like we just discussed, with the big villains like the cars and the SUVs, maybe some of the bridges and the over bridges and the flyovers will lose their context. Can you suggest some alternative uses of these structures? I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, the High Line in New York, which is an old raised high railway, is absolutely brilliant. If any of you been to New York, and probably it's less likely you get there in the near future, it's now a wonderful park. In Seoul, they have turned a big motorway highway coming into the 6-lane highway coming into the city into a park. It's something I would like to do with the motorway that comes into the city, 4-lane motorway that comes in, 6-lane if you count the side. In Bristol, I would love to do that, but it's a challenge because we don't have control over what is actually a national highway. Yes, I think that we need to look at the potential of changing these big highways into a combination of public transport routes, because public transport is so much more efficient when it is on roads that don't have other cars, and into cycle paths, and into leisure. I think there are growing number of examples. Somebody's asked, manufacturing industries are getting affected due to pandemic situation, might cause unemployment. Oh yeah, no, that was the unemployment. What can be the best possibility to restore? Right, I think I've talked about that. Yes,
gone through that. Yes, but yes, there is one question about the global economy suffering and the importance that we need to put in for green building. Will that suffer too? Because we know that sustainability or green buildings are costly in the beginning. So given that and the dipping economy, is this going to suffer? Is this movement going to suffer? What is your opinion?
The only way we get greener buildings if we have an accounting system and a tax system that encourages investment rather than encouraging us getting away with the least investment and the greatest expense down the line, because cheap buildings result in more expensive energy and more expensive running costs and more expensive repair and if in extreme situations like some of the high buildings will result in eventual demolition or radical change if they're to be bearable to live in. So I think we need a tax system that encourages investment in green buildings, and we need we need a higher oil price. And one of the biggest fears I have is that the oil price has dived, and this will encourage the use of carbon fuels at a time when we should be doing what India is doing, is investing in wind and solar and the renewables. And I think it's, India's in a wonderful place in terms of investing in wind, especially in the southern plains, and solar, because you get more sun than quite a lot more.
Yes. So there's one question, but you probably answered that one. Seems to be a perception that can we design public streets where people can buy products without coming into contact with one another? But perhaps you'd like to answer that by elaborating that we don't have to be completely out of contact.
Oh, absolutely. I think, no, it'd be a nightmare if we're completely out of contact. I think streets inevitably are going to have less of the big brand stores. I think they're going to dwindle. I think we will have people setting up smaller, independent local enterprise. I think there will be I think markets will survive, outdoor markets in particular, just the spacing of them may need looking at. I think street food will survive, but it's just the spacing that will need looking at. And I think that you can have a huge amount of social activity without people being absolutely hugger-mugger next to each other. I think we will get more in the way, and maybe this exists more in India already, but I'm setting up a makers market for people who make things locally to be able to sell from their workshop, which is in effect a market round a square. And I think those are the things that will help boost the local economy, help bring people together, and I think be a real benefit coming out of a crisis. But the high street will look very different. One thing that I'm very sad about. I think that it's going to take a long time for those places that people congregate in within restricted space, like theatres and cinemas, and goodness knows what's going to happen to Bollywood cinemas. What you have to do, I think, is to we have more outside theatre with people more space, more outside cinema with people more space in the interim until people have got the confidence to gather again in these places. And all those require design. So I think, optimistically, there are huge opportunities for design coming out of this when there's change. But I think it's incumbent on us as educated individuals, as architects and designers, to not just design our own, in our own little world, but also to put pressure on the lawmakers to enable these changes to be made. I think there are huge opportunities, and designers have that obligation, I think, to demonstrate what's possible and to lobby for it.
Yes, absolutely. So we are nearing the end. I'll just forward you two questions. One is, how do we as a community support people without homes, homeless people? How do we prepare ourselves for such an emergency if it should, God forbid, come in the near future or in the future?
I mean, that's a huge issue, that whether pandemic or not, the whole issue of homelessness is a massive issue. It's a big issue in this country. And it's shocking to me that in a first world country like the UK, and even more so like the USA, that there are so many people sleeping by railway lines and on the streets, not so much by railway lines in the UK, but certainly in the States. I think we have to look at a civilized form of interim housing that we can produce fast. I mean, there are people producing some very good housing out of shipping containers, for instance, in this country. And I think there is a great challenge of how we produce communities of interim housing solutions. But they've got to be proper communities around social facilities and not just tents by the roadside, which is even the best for some people.
One good question that this has just come up is saying that because streets are now empty, almost empty, zero traffic, do you think it's a good time to take up some city development project?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's a good time to repair the streets. It's also a good time to paint pedestrian crossings across them wherever you want. But it's also a good time to have a look at some of this space and think, should we actually build on it? There are some spaces that are ridiculously large and become even more expansive in these conditions. And we should think about urban design that becomes maybe that uses space in an imaginative way to provide facilities for people. Play places. I mean, maybe some of the streets you could have some of this recreation, not just using streets for getting about, but you could have some recreation. We now have outdoor table tennis around the city. We sometimes have pianos around the city, and I think use the streets as places for pleasure as well as for places to get around.
So there's one question that when we think about public transport and less cars on the streets, then aren't we keeping too many people in one place and therefore adding to the potential? So we are all in that COVID mood, and we're saying that public transport, that's too many people in one place. So how does that throw up?
Because of public transport being, well, I think EasyJet have just said that they will not put anybody in the middle seats so that everybody is separated. And I think the bus companies have got to do things like that. There's been a great debate around the use of masks, but it seems pretty likely that masks help, and that legislation for mask use during use of public transport in this interim time. But there will be a time we will come out of it, and people will be happy to sit next to each other. But yes, that is true. But I think people will find a huge amount of pleasure in walking, and therefore we need cities that are designed with facilities close to where people live. And because of car dependency, distances have become too great. And so I think India has a huge opportunity, because you've got lots of people who are enterprising with small businesses who will create will create those things that are more local to where people live, so that they don't have to travel to the same extent. And I think workplaces need to become more local too, to some of where the people live, instead of having this great barrier between living districts and downtown working districts. We need much more of a mix.
And we'll have to come to an end, but there's one question from a student who says that, building of projects are on site. You need to be there to be able to do it. So it's not work from home doesn't really work there.
Oh no, absolutely. Manufacturing, building sites.
Profession, yes.
We still have some people on building sites. Some of our builders are operating even during this time, and they're operating with proper distancing. Which can be challenging occasionally, but generally somebody laying bricks or installing windows or whatever can do it while maintaining the 2-meter distance. I think up to the construction industry to set the rules that enable people to keep that proper distancing. But it's an opportunity for construction if we're sensible.
Yes, we have to end with this one last question, which is about the healthcare system. And it asks that, the spread of a virus is very hard to control, especially in big. So what are your thoughts on, small, clustered, and maybe even mobile hospitals?
Well, I think in terms of, it comes back to the question about the villages and the countryside and how they get access to these things. I think there's a huge possibility of having mobile medical facilities, and that it's really important that we do. We have built some massive hospitals in the UK over the past few weeks, converting exhibition halls and things like that, conference centres and what have you, into hospitals. I think that is a temporary thing, but there will always be, I think, a need for both the large and the small, but having community hospitals has to be a good thing.